I've never been much of a skeptic. I was the type of kid that used to bone up on haunted dolls and magic tricks and ghost stories in my free time. This all happened when I was 12, and I'm 20 now. So it's possible that a lot of this is going to be muddled by my poor memory and my own inclination toward believing in the supernatural. Just keep that in mind, I guess. I'm going to try to be as impartial as possible. My dad used to date this chick named Adrian. They'd been going pretty steady for about a decade. I stayed with my mom most of the time, but I went to visit my dad every other weekend. They lived in this shitty old blue house in the middle of some nothing city. The kind of house where you had to hook the dishwasher up to the sink and you could stick your fingers into the spaces eaten away between the floorboards. It was easily 100 years old, but that didn't make it creepy. It just made it kind of gross and annoying. It was always pretty messy there. My dad was dirt broke and working full-time. Adrian couldn't work because of fibromyalgia. So whenever I visited, I was basically on dishes duty. I can still barely stand doing the dishes to this day because of how gross that old kitchen used to get. My roommates still hate me for this a little bit. There was almost always mold involved because of how little ever got done around the house whenever I wasn't around to take care of it. But regardless of how nasty it got, that was just chores. I loved spending time with my dad, so I could handle the chores. It was only 2 days at a time, and it was only every other weekend. Just 2 days. Just every other weekend. That's how I told myself I could handle the rest of it too. I never told my mom or my dad because I felt so guilty saying it out loud. But sometimes I totally dreaded going over there. I didn't want my dad to think it was because he was poor or because I didn't like spending time with him, because that wasn't true. I was always scared because of Adrian. It started off with little things. Maybe they're not actually all that bad. I was a pretty anxious kid, so I could react negatively to things most kids my age would have shrugged off. Adrian would have her friends over, and they'd weep to her about their abusive boyfriends. Adrian was always a very empathetic person, so I understood why they would go to her. But the things they talked about were things I just wasn't ready to hear as a kid. I I remember driving out with my dad to pick up one of her friend's daughters from the train station after her dad got too drunk and abandoned her there. I remember being the only one concerned about one of her friend's 2-year-old son when he hadn't seen him in a while. I found him at the top of the stairs, outside, with a pair of old hedge trimmers. Whenever my dad wasn't around, I felt like I was the only person in the house with some kind of control over the situation. And at the same time, I felt completely powerless. Sometimes Adrian was fun and artistic and vivacious, encouraging me to express myself through my art. She was even one of the first people I came out to as gay, and she accepted me without missing a beat. I think deep down, she was a good person, and that's why she wanted to help all the vulnerable people in her life. But I wouldn't be typing this all out if it was just a case of unfortunate circumstances. As kind and non-judgmental as Adrian was, sometimes, other times, she was a complete monster. Gradually, things got worse and worse over and over. I told myself I only had to stick it out for 2 days at a time. When she started to scream at me for not scrubbing the tiles behind the coffee pot thoroughly enough, or when she'd disappear for hours in the night without answering my dad's phone calls, only to come back in the morning saying she'd just run into friends at the store, or when she'd berate me so harshly for every dumb kid mistake I made that I'd run off to the brown pocketed shower so no one would see me crying. She wasn't always so bad. Just 2 days. Just 2 days at a time. And sometimes those 2 days weren't so bad at all. Until one weekend, we hit a snowstorm. Our front yard had snow that came up to my knees, frozen over with a solid ½ inch of ice on top. The roads were so icy that even those big snow plow trucks couldn't get through. School was canceled for a week. There was no way my dad could drive me back to my mom's place in weather like that. I was trapped in that house for 5 days. And it was not the kind of week where Adrian had been particularly pleasant. But my dad always taught me to be strong. I buckled down and told myself that if I could handle 2 days, I could survive 5. I guess I wasn't wrong, but nothing could have prepared me for how bad things would get. I spent most of my time outside in the snow during the first 3 days, because it doesn't snow very often where I'm from. I was pretty excited about all of it. As long as I was outside, I wouldn't have to deal with my dad and Adrian fighting over the fact that Adrian had gone out at midnight the night before, only to come back with a friend of hers that they couldn't reasonably house for the duration of this snowstorm. I wouldn't have to deal with the moldy dishes. I wouldn't have to deal with the screaming. Obviously, that didn't last. The evening of my third day there, when I came in all cold from the snow, Adrian was waiting for me in the living room. She was smiling, but I felt all the blood in my face drop down to my chest. My dad had fallen asleep early. By the sound of it, her friend was in the shower. She asked me why I hadn't cleaned the kitchen in the 3 days I'd been there already. And of course, I didn't have an answer that I could give her. What could I have said? I couldn't just tell her that I was scared of being around her. I know it doesn't sound that bad, but she already screamed at me over a glass I'd left out until I shut down the night I got here. I quietly agreed and told her I was sorry. I wasn't allowed to do anything else until I made that kitchen spotless, and I wasn't allowed to go outside the next day. The kitchen was worse than usual. Sometime earlier in the week, their fridge had broken, and everything inside had gathered a thick, fuzzy coat of mold. They'd since gotten a large chest cooler to replace the fridge in the meantime, but nobody had touched the mess yet. I couldn't blame them too much. Adrian was in too much pain to stand and clean. My dad was allergic to mold. That didn't make me feel any better about having to do it myself. The rotten smell of the blue and green mold made the inside of my nose burn as I scraped the worst of it into the garbage. At some point, Adrian's friend came out of the bathroom, hair pulled up into a towel. The bathroom door in that old house was right at the far end of the kitchen, to the right of the sink, where I was working, so she walked right past me. She looked disgusted, and in that moment, it felt like it was pointed not at the kitchen, but at me. I kept cleaning. Most of what was in the fridge was salvageable, but a few things were beyond saving. No matter how much I scrubbed, the putrid muck just seemed to spread. It was midnight before I was comfortable enough with my work to take my boots off and go to bed. The next day, I mostly stayed in my room, too scared to come out and find out what else I could do to make Adrian scream at me. The room I stayed in was an addition that had been haphazardly stapled to the rest of the house decades after it was built. It contained a large bed, which was built into the wall, the washer and dryer, a small TV and VCR, a currently snowed-in door to the backyard, and nothing else. The door was too thin to mask any of the noises in the rest of the house, but it at least gave me a place where I could be anxious about anyone looking at me for a while. In the morning, before Adrian had woken up, I spotted my dad in the living room. He told me the kitchen looked good. I told him about the glass I'd left on the coffee table the night I got there, and how Adrian freaked out at me over it. He had been helping a neighbor with something when it happened, so it was news to him. Adrian was insidious like that. She'd always wait until no one was around to catch her belittling a middle schooler. It was the first time I'd ever told my dad about something she'd done to me. It was the first time I couldn't justify keeping quiet on the grounds that I would only be there one more day. He said he'd talk to her about it, and I went back to my room. For the first time in that house, I felt relief. My dad would talk to her about it, and then she would stop. She would realize that what she was doing was scaring me. I wouldn't have to dread seeing my dad anymore. I spent the rest of the day calming myself down in my room. Years and years ago, my dad had recorded a 6-hour marathon of Ren and Stimpy on VHS, and I was content to curl up under my blankets and watch it on repeat until I could go home to my mom. Every time I heard footsteps passing by the door, I felt my blood run cold. And nobody ever knocked. I was comfortable in the low, constant thrum of my anxiety. That evening, the power went out. I came out of my room with my little red flashlight to see what the deal was. The heat was on. I could hear its subtle hum in the background, only to encounter a horrible moment of déjà vu. There was Adrian, sitting on the couch. My dad wasn't with her. The shower was running again. The smell of something putrid singed the inside of my nose. As I passed by the kitchen to shakily approach her in the living room, I didn't dare look. If there was somehow more mold I had missed, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know about it. Adrian was smiling at me, the same way she had smiled the night before. I swallowed hard against the bile threatening to rise in my throat. The further into the living room I got, the more suffocating that hot stench of decay felt in my lungs. I opened my mouth to say something once I was close enough to speak to her. But before I could make a sound, she grabbed me by the collar and pulled me down to her eye level. Her breath smelled like wine, but underneath that pungent smear of alcohol, I realized her breath smelled like mold, too. Her smile dropped. She lowered her voice, looking at me in the eyes because I didn't dare look away from her. Don't you ever tell on me again. The second she let go of my collar, I backed into the coffee table fast enough to bruise the back of my calf. I nodded and mumbled a frantic apology. She had never hit me before, but the force of her yanking me down was enough to stretch the collar of my shirt halfway down my chest. And I really didn't want to tempt her. She didn't have to tell me to go clean up whatever mold I'd missed in the kitchen that was causing that awful smell. I was on my way already. When I rounded the corner, the light from the flashlight caught on the steam billowing from the cracked door of the bathroom. The shower was still running. It was hot and humid in a way that felt sickening, unnatural. I had been buried under blankets in my room from the indoor chill of the snow outside. But now I could feel sweat dripping down the back of my neck. The steam, I quickly realized, smelled rancid. My hand was shaking so bad that the doorknob rattled when I touched it. But I pulled the bathroom door open anyway. It's hard for me to describe what I saw in that bathroom. It was dark and obscured in equal parts by the steam and paralyzing terror. The shower curtain was pulled all the way back, and lying in the bathtub was a pulsing mass of gray-green, the brown speckles of shower mold now layered thickly on the walls like shingles. The corner of the red floral shirt and painted toenails were all I could see left of Adrian's friend. Through the festering heap clinging to her form, mouth open wide and full of black arms, curled against her dissected chest. I gagged. I screamed. I threw my flashlight at it and ran out the back door without shoes on. The thick, cold layer of ice over the snow bit at my bare feet. As I called for my dad, I saw the bathroom window slam open, and I slipped. The next thing I remember is my dad driving me home on newly salted roads. By the next time I came to visit, they had gotten a new fridge.